There was a radio program years ago called I Love a Mystery. Any of you old enough to remember that program? Yeah, a few of you are. I once opined that God must love a mystery as well because He presents us with so many of them. But then I have to confess, I don't think God creates mysteries for the fun of it, as you and I might. I think mysteries exist because there are so many things that are simply beyond our capacity to grasp them. I mean, God could explain it to us and it would go in one ear and out the other because we have no hooks to hang it on. We simply don't get it. I know that there are many mysteries found in the Bible. I know it was written in another language, in another culture, and there's a lot of stuff that we just simply don't know that's outside of our knowledge base. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things that we are not programmed to understand. Because we are programmed, you know. Just like a computer has to have an operating system in order to do anything, we also have an operating system. You know, we were made that way. We were given a logical system so that we could actually put knowledge together, organize knowledge, be able to develop speech, be able to communicate with one another, and, incidentally, to communicate with God. So all that was done as a part of the operating system. As it happens, our system of thought addresses everything in terms of a beginning and a middle and an end. We don't really have a way of grasping things that don't have an end, and especially things that don't have a beginning, that just simply are there, are eternal, and always will be. It's hard enough for me, it always has been, to imagine living into the future forever. I remember even as a young fellow, lying in bed at night with, my mind wandering off into the future somewhere, and I'd heard the preacher speak about living forever, and I thought, I wonder what that's like. No end and going on. And then I turned around and looked back, trying to grasp the idea that God had no beginning, and my mind shorted out. The circuit breaker left me or something because there was nothing I could do. It just doesn't compute. We don't think that way. I mean, not that we can't accept it if we're told that, but I'm talking about understanding and grasping how it could even begin to be so. Now, I don't mean to say by this either that we can't understand God. We can. But we can only understand Him in the terms in which He reveals Himself. We take one step beyond that, and we're lost. We're out in the dark with no clues. And I want to add one more element for you to think about. The Bible only deals with Project Earth. I call it a project because God has been here forever. And if you think this is the first project He has ever put His hand to, you're not thinking clearly. We were made in His image. We are like Him a lot. And consequently, the idea of sitting around doing nothing forever wouldn't occur to us. Why should we think it would occur to Him? And I often find myself pondering, what in the world did He do before He said, let there be light? And before the planning of Project Earth? Because all this process took place in a kind of time, not our kind, but His kind. And so we're left, staggering around the dark. Now, people who refuse to acknowledge the limits that we have in knowledge often become conspiracy theorists of one form or another. There was a famous astronomer once who said that the universe is not only queerer than we imagine, it's queerer than we can imagine. So he acknowledged the limits of the human imagination. Even Einstein, I think, recognized that. Now, as I said, people who refuse to recognize the limits to the human imagination find themselves oftentimes being conspiracy theorists or listening to conspiracy theorists one way or another. In theology, this sort of thing crops up in expressions like this. This truth was lost 1,900 years ago and has been suppressed by the Roman Catholic Church only to be discovered and restored in our generation. Is conspiracy that the Roman Catholic Church deliberately had it, suppressed it, and wouldn't let the rest of us have it. But the truth is, I hear that kind of thing. The more I think about it, the Yiddish expression chutzpah comes to mind, that the gall to think that 1,900 years after all this stuff got started, we could find something that's been lost, suppressed, hidden, tied away for all these generations, when in fact, the only thing that we have authoritatively to go on relative to the Christian faith is the Bible. And we have it, Everybody else has it. It's been around for all these years. And while some people tried to keep the Bible locked up for a lot of years, they couldn't keep it locked up forever. And men like Tyndale and others came along and unlocked it for all of us English-speaking people. And in turn, because of us, unlocked it for the rest of the world, us and the Gideons, to get it done. Now, the early Christian theologians ran head on into some of these problems that we find ourselves sometimes struggling with to this day. And they were bedeviled by know-it-alls who had the answer to every question. That's a terrible temptation to think I have to be able to explain everything. Actually, I think it's a disease. I can't tell you how grateful I am to have been cured of that disease. I've said this more than once, that one of the greatest things that ever happened to me was the freedom to say, I don't know, and leave it there, walk away from it. But they ran into these problems with things like the letter to the Hebrews, which you have right there in your Bible. It posed a very immediate problem. The letter was authentic is not even in dispute. Nobody questions that. Even the best modern scholarship, even the most progressive modern scholarship, if I may use that term, placed this letter in the first century. Some of those who think maybe the Gospels were written in the second century believe this one was first century. I think, and a lot of scholars think, it was written before 70 A.D. Now, can you think, from your knowledge of the book of Hebrews, why someone would be so sure that the letter was written before 70 A.D.? The answer is there for any English reader to see in the pages. The writer of the book of Hebrews is utterly unaware of the destruction of the temple. If the temple had been destroyed, you think about this now, for any Jew in the first century, the first half of the first century, wouldn't the destruction of the temple be the dominant event and issue of your lifetime? And that of the church and everything else. And this is one of the reasons why I feel quite confident that every word of the New Testament was written before the temple was destroyed. Because in the New Testament, other than Jesus' prophecy about not one stone going to be left on top of another that would not be thrown down, apart from that, there is no reference to it. It's unheard of. And there is no way that could possibly happen. If we had lived in that time and we were writing letters back and forth to one another, those letters would contain references to the loss, the destruction, the horror of Jerusalem, what happened to it, and how the temple was destroyed. We have no place now to go to pray. Because the early Christian disciples in Jerusalem went to the temple every day to pray. I think it would have been such a momentous event that an English reader would notice the difference. I'm not going to digress into this to try to demonstrate that to you. You can determine it for yourself. Just read the epistle with the question in mind. Did this writer know the temple had been destroyed? And you finish the book, you'll have your conclusion. So what was the problem that this document posed for the early church? It was momentous. Here we've got something to grapple with. The author of Hebrews challenges us on a singular idea. Now, it doesn't so much challenge you and I as it challenged the Jewish Christians of the first century, because it cut straight across the grain of a cultural worldview, an impression of God, an idea of God, of what they'd carried all their lives. And he hits it immediately. This doesn't even have a preamble. It doesn't say hello and greetings from all the saints over here. He just starts. In the past, I'm reading from the NIV, in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, and through whom He made the universe. This is huge, folks. What he just said here is huge. When he says the Son is the heir of all things, that's rather more than I can get my mind around, because all things includes the planets all the way out to the quasars at the edge of the known universe. Heir of all things. But then when he says He made this universe through Him, that is even bigger. Again, you have to put yourself in a position of a Jew living in the first century, who all his lifetime had stated that it had recited the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And his whole monotheism is in this, and his belief in what we finally would come to know as the Father being the creator of all things is shattered on this verse. And so he says he made the universe through the Son. The reason this was such a problem is that a simple reading of the Bible by a simple-minded person, like me, I used to be, still am to a degree, brings Jesus into existence a mere 60 years or so before the book of Hebrews was written. He wasn't around before that. Now, I grew up as a Baptist. I read the Bible daily. I went to church. I heard hundreds of sermons, hundreds of altar calls. I don't know how much I heard in that place. But I assumed all through those years that the Father was the sole creator of the universe and that Jesus began existence when he was born of Mary and not before. That's what I believe. Now, what's really funny about that is the Baptist Church, if it has anything that could be called a system of beliefs, doesn't believe that. They believe in the pre-existence of Christ, never talked about it, which was a strange thing. And so you could grow up reading the Bible, and you have the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, and on you go down through life. What the earliest Christian thinkers had to grapple with was a plain statement that the Son of God was involved in the creation of Genesis 1. Now, it's a shocking thing to consider, but it's right there on the page. It was the one we know now as Jesus who said, "Let there be light." And suddenly, there was all the light that would be in this universe. It's fair to say that a lot of Christians, most of whom were Jews to start with, found that opening jarring in Hebrews, because it just ran so contrary to everything they had always thought, believed, anything that they came. I think it's fair to say that not a few of them charged out to find a way to explain it that was consistent with their belief system. They were not very successful because as time progressed, the church, the whole church, came to accept this statement of Hebrews 1 and 2 as being true. This is what they had to struggle with. Let's read it again. In the time past, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. So what can we know about this Son? The author of Hebrews goes on. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his, that is the Son's, powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Someone once asked, if you were able in vision to walk into the throne room of the universe, would you see one person or two sitting there? His conclusion is, you would see one. I think his point of view was Trinitarian. But then we have this statement here, he has gone up there and sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Now, again, us simple-minded folks may want to look at that and say, it seems to me like he was not beside himself. There was one there who was seated at the right hand of another who was there. That's not that difficult. Now, he went on to say about this, he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, this day have I begotten you, or become your father? Or again, I will be his father, and he will be my son. Now, I find it very difficult to believe, as some do, that Jesus was an angel in time past. Because what the question here is asking, the tacit answer is, he never said this to any angel. It's only said to the one who was to be his son. I think Paul, who wrote this book, makes it clear that this was never said to any other angel, any of the angels. Our problem, the problem of many have gone before, is that the whole idea of angels has become distorted in popular imagination. You should know this. In both Greek and Hebrew, the word that is rendered to angels, and universally in your Bibles, means messenger. That's all. It just means messenger. It doesn't imply anything about wings. It doesn't imply anything about the ability to go through walls or to disappear at will or anything of the sort. All it means is messenger. And you only discern the class of messenger you're dealing with by the context. That's not that hard to understand. It's a shame that the words are not rendered in English as messenger everywhere they are, because that would free us to consider the idea more fully and the context more fully so that we could come to a conclusion about what the Bible is trying to say. But you can do that as you read. Just remember, everywhere you see it, Old Testament, New Testament. A better rendering is messenger, which contains the ambiguity that God intended in that word that is used in the New and Old Testament. And again, when God brings His firstborn into the world, He says, let all the angels of God worship Him. And speaking of the angels, He said, He makes His angels wind, His servants flame of fire. But to the Son, He says, and this is where it gets really confusing to us because it just doesn't work with our system of logic. Now, what you have to be careful with when you're reading this first chapter of Hebrews are the pronouns. If you can keep your pronouns lined up so you know who is talking about, and all the he's and hims are pointed in the right direction, you get a very clear impression of what's being said. The problem with the impression is it doesn't fit your system of logic. Listen to what he says. But about the Son, He, the Father, says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness will be the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions, anointing you with the oil of joy. So, we have a problem here. The logic of our language deserts us right here. And I expect this passage created no end of consternation among early Jewish Christian readers of it. Now, we are safest if we just take it like He says it. God is speaking. About the Son, He says, your throne, O God, will last forever. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions. Now, there's only one way to take it that I can see. There are two here who are called God. One is speaking, the other is spoken to. Now, I suppose this is part of the reasoning of Christian theologians who accepted that Father and Son are both God. They are using the term God in a generic sense. There's only reason that this need be a problem for us if we insist that the word God only and always means the one supreme being of all the universe. If you insist on that, you're going to be lost here. There's nowhere to go with it. But if we can bring ourselves to understand that God is a kind of being, similar to the way a human is a kind of being, the difficulty disappears. My father and I, when he was alive, were both human, of human kind. The divine Father and Son are both God, of the God kind. The word God, I believe, is used in about 7 or 8 different ways in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew. And there's no reason to why you have to insist that it means one thing and one thing everywhere it ever shows up. It depends on the context. Now, there may be another way of seeing this, but I haven't seen it. I just haven't. To me, this is all that makes any sense. I've read some very strained arguments looking for another way. But in my opinion, they did violence to the plain meaning of the text that's in front of us here. Now, he continues. He, God, is still speaking. Also says, in the beginning, O Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Whose? Well, from the chapter 1, verse 1, it's talking about Christ. It's the work of His hands. All these things will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe. Like a garment they will be changed. But you remain the same, and your years will never end. To which of the angels did God ever say, sit on my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to minister to those who are the heirs of salvation? All the angels are servants on a great plantation who work for the heirs. And guess who that is? It's us. Now, this first chapter of the book of Hebrews is staggering. It opens a window on eternity that we can kind of peer through and try to understand what it is we are seeing here. Now, if this were all we had, we might find a way to find room for another point of view. We might at least consider if there's a translation error or some such. And I sat down with the Greek this morning. I'm sorry, the guys that have done all these translations have basically all got it the same and got it right. Now, we might at least consider this, but this isn't all we have. This discussion does not stop here. Listen again to how this chapter begins. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. In these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. I looked it up. The translation is correct. Now, he is flat out making the statement that the Son was the agent of the universe. How did Paul understand this? I think Paul wrote Hebrews, but let's suppose he didn't for a moment. How did he understand it? If you turn over, he makes an unambiguous statement in Ephesians chapter 3. And there's a textual problem here which I'll come to. Paul says, unto me who am the least of all saints, this is Ephesians 3 verse 8, is this grace given that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to make men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world has been hid in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ. He even calls it a mystery. Now, as I said, we might find a way to explain the first chapter of Hebrews. We still got this to deal with. Now, there's a telltale textual issue in this verse. Modern versions follow the NIV, which says, which for ages past was kept hidden in God who created all things, period. It does not go on to say, through Jesus Christ. The received text includes through Jesus Christ, using the same expression that you found in the book of Hebrews, which I presume that means that the Byzantine texts include this statement. The scholar, when he finds two versions of a Greek text, has a set of questions. It's basically, they've all agreed over the years that there are certain principles they used in textual criticism to decide, does this one belong or does that one belong? Now, they give unusually heavy weight to older manuscripts, which may or may not be a good idea, because just because this manuscript is older than this one doesn't mean that the path through which it was copied is better than this one, which has taken longer. There are those who believe to this day that the Byzantine text may in some ways be better than the old Alexandrinus or the old Sinaiticus, because for the simple reason that the discipline that was exercised in their preservations was better. Anyhow, what they have to decide when they've come across something like this is, was that expression, through Jesus Christ, added by a copyist to this set of documents, or was it deleted from this set of documents by a different scribe? Now, I'm not going to take the time today to try to explain to you how scriptoriums work, how they actually went through the process of laboriously copying out all these things by hand, how when they would sometimes come to the end of a line, they would skip a line in the process of copying and just leave it out. Well, you probably have done that yourself if you ever did much copying. It's easy to do. You come to the end of the line, your eye skips, and it makes a certain amount of sense, and so you just leave it out. Keep on going. That sort of thing happens. Now, the question you have, the more important questions are, why, if it was not there, would someone consciously, and you would have to do this consciously, make a decision to add it to the text? And then, if it was not there, if it is there, there's an accidental thing possibly of deleting it from the text, or somebody makes a conscious decision to delete it from the text. In my opinion, it's far more likely to be deleted than added to this particular passage. It's hard for me to imagine a serious Greek scholar in a scriptorium very early on adding those words. I think the scholarly theory would be that he picked them up from Hebrews, or he picked it up from Colossians and decided it belonged here, and he put it in, but I doubt it. I imagine it was there, and that it accidentally or deliberately got deleted. The reason why it would have been deleted, possibly, is because it was very difficult for early Jewish Christian scribes to think this way. It made them uncomfortable, and I can easily see someone dropping it from this text, while a copyist over there did not drop it from his text, and thus we have two families of text. Some have it, some don't. Now, that little lesson is free of charge. It's just a little added to the sermon for your understanding. Okay, here's the thing, though. This still isn't all. We're not done with this. Roll back to the book of Colossians, chapter 1, verse 15. Here there is no textual disagreement at all. Colossians 1:15. Speaking of Jesus, it said, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, for by him were all things created that are in heaven, in the earth, visible, invisible, whether they be thrones, dominions, principalities, power, all things were created by him
Now, this is really strong stuff that he's doing here, and there's no mistaking what he's saying here. The Greek prepositions support it entirely. Sometimes in Greek, prepositions are not there, they're understood, and as a result of that, you might be able to put a different preposition in and change the meaning. But in every case I've come to so far, the preposition is there. It is not understood. And therefore, you basically are stuck with it. And that's what this one here means. Now, when I see this, I read it, I said, yikes, there's no textual problem here. Every modern version follows King James right down the line on it. And it's comprehensive. And I can think that this letter must have created no small heartburn among Jewish scribes, really, and among Jewish Christians, because it just made them rethink things that they had believed all their lives. Anyway, he goes on to say, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence, for it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell. Now, there's nowhere to go with this. There really isn't. It's not talking about the Father when it says he is before all things and all things consist. Because the Father has given to Christ to be the head of the church, so he is the beginning, and the firstborn from the dead, words that do not apply in any way, shape, form, or fashion to the Father. So, we now have a faint picture forming in our minds of an eternal relationship of Father and Son. We could quibble over any number of small questions around this, like was he the Son before his human birth, or was he the Son from the foundation of the world? Let's don't worry about that right here. We have an eternal relationship between two, Father and Son. Now, this suggests, as I said, the one who said, let there be light, was none other than the Son. If that's all confusing to us, we should resist thinking that it's wrong. Just because you're confused by something says nothing about whether it's right or wrong. Just because early Jewish Christian scribes were confused by this doesn't mean we toss it out. They were confused about a lot of stuff, as we find. In fact, the program is playing this weekend, if you want to pick it up on the internet or elsewhere, deals with this particular issue when Jewish Christians, particularly those who were of the sect of the Pharisees who believe, nearly stopped or tried to stop the gospel from going to Gentiles entirely, because what Paul was doing, what everybody was teaching, what the church was doing, ran so counter to what they thought about the law of God, particularly the law of Moses, not just the law of God, that they couldn't cope with it. Now, there is a temptation in all human beings to toss things out that don't fit our preconceptions. If you use the jigsaw puzzle analogy, we might very well, for example, find a piece that the color is right, the shape is roughly right, but for some reason it just doesn't want to go in there. My father always used to joke, he'd get out his little penknife and go through the motions of saying, let's shave this thing off and get it to where it goes in there, because it obviously should go there. Don't do that with God's Word. Another thing you might be tempted to do is say, I don't think this piece even belongs in this puzzle. Toss it in the trash. You know, as sure as you do that, you'll get all the way down that puzzle. There'll be one hole left in the middle of it that piece would have fit, but you threw it out. So you're far better off. Excuse me, my nose is itching something ferociously today. But you really have to be careful when you look at this type of thing. There are some things that you just don't do. You don't toss things out, and you don't reshape them. You file them away. I remember this statement that made about Mary when all this information about her son that was going to be born was dumped on her, and all the events that happened subsequent to his birth. We're told that Mary hid these things in her heart and pondered them. She didn't get it. She didn't really understand it. She had no idea where it was going to go and had no idea of the pain she would be able to suffer. But she didn't toss any of it out. She just filed it away in her heart. We should also resist being a know-it-all. The know-it-all thinks he has to explain everything and is uncomfortable with things that are left unexplained. I don't have that problem. I personally am quite content to leave some things and say, I can't explain that, we'll leave it alone. It's this know-it-all complex that leads to conspiracy theories. There's a fundamental difference, by the way, between an agnostic and an atheist. The difference is the agnostic is honest and the atheist is not. The agnostic says, I don't know. He's just being honest. The atheist says he does know something that cannot possibly be known. Not by anybody's system of logic. You cannot know that there is no God. Impossible. He looks down his nose at and belittles those who don't know what he declares he knows. So don't be a know-it-all, Be content to leave some things on the shelf. Be content to say, I'll come back and visit that later. I'll wait on that until God shows it to me and helps me to understand it. No one likes a know-it-all. Don't be one. And don't listen to one either. Far better to hide these things in our heart. Now, to add to all of this that I've given you so far, there was one disciple who seems to have had a special relationship with Jesus. He calls himself, actually, that disciple whom Jesus loved, uses that expression. And it kind of goes contrary to the grain to think that any one of the 12 would have been more important to Jesus than the other one. It doesn't say more important. He just says that disciple whom Jesus loved. He was in a singularly important place at the Last Supper. He was right next to Jesus. And there's every indication that he had that special relationship. Now, here is what he had to say about all this. And it probably formed the foundation of what Paul would later write. It's in John chapter 1. It's an old, familiar scripture. You probably could quote it from memory. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Now, when you look at this in the Greek, there's no question about who the antecedent of without Him is. It's the Word. That's all. Pure and simple. And, of course, if that's all we had, we might not figure that out, but we don't have just that. We've got Colossians, we've got Ephesians, we've got Hebrews, all of which say the same thing, that everything was made by Christ. Now, it's at this point, though, that our system of logic wants to rebel. How is it possible to be God and be with God? I already made the joke about being beside yourself. The traditional doctrine of the Trinity offers a way of explaining this, but if you've ever read very much of the Trinity, it still remains a mystery. They call it the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Let's take a step away from this and look at it again. Is it possible to be Stephen, your name is Stephen, and to be with Stephen at the same time? Piece of cake. Two Stephens. Do we have two Stephens in here? We have one Stephen in here. Oh, I picked a good name for that then. That's not really a problem. Two guys have the same name. I'm always amused, by the way, when I get a letter to me that's signed, it says, starts off Dear Ron, and is signed at the end, Ron. Like I'm talking to myself, but I'm not, of course. I have one friend who writes, he signs his letters, the other Ron. This offers us a way, I think, to understand the word God. God is a descriptive term for the beings that are involved in all of this, and it just happens there are at least two of them. Now, all things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. That's it. Everything. This connects with Hebrews, Ephesians, and Colossians. This whole thing is locked in. Who created the universe? Who created everything? All things? The last nerd of everything? The one we know as Jesus. The antecedent is the Word. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in darkness, and the darkness just didn't get it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, this is written by John about the other John, John the Baptist. The same came to bear witness of the light that men through him might believe. He was not that light. He was sent to bear witness of that light, that true light that lights every man that comes into the world. Listen to this. He was in the world, and the world was made by Him, and the world knew Him not. There it is again. He was in the world. The world was made by Him, and the world didn't know Him. Once again, we have confirmation. He was in the world. Who was in the world? The Son was in the world. The one who was in the world made the world. How many ways this has to be sent to us before we can get it, throw our heads around it? I really think it was hard, though, for those first century Christians. Jewish Christians. Probably not nearly so hard for the Gentiles. He came unto His own, that is to Israel, and His own received Him not. They was indeed despised by the religious establishment at the time. But as many as received him, to him he gave the power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. Those who received him. Oh man, what words. There were some who did and some who didn't then, just as there are today. The power to become sons of God. You know, in a way, it's fascinating to me that it is the Son of God who grants power to others to become the sons of God. I don't think he means it to be in terms of grandsons, because Jesus is presented as our brother, and yet in one of the prophecies he's called the everlasting Father. Now we come to the crunch of what John is driving at, verse 14, which is really I think in a way the climax of the whole statement. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So the Word became known to us as Jesus the Christ. Now, how could that possibly be? Well, just because you and I have a hard time explaining it doesn't mean anything, really. It just is there. And there is nothing new under the sun. The early Christian theologians had to wrestle with all this, and they couldn't get away from it. The pre-existence of Jesus Christ, as it's called by some people, is not merely a Catholic doctrine. You should know this. If you don't, you may want to write it down so you don't forget it. There was no such thing as the Roman Catholic Church until the 4th century. Didn't exist. There were churches all over the landscape in that period of time, bishops scattered around all the major cities. We know about the bishop in Alexandria, know about the bishop of Antioch, the bishop of Rome. In fact, there were some 300 bishops at that time, all apparently equal and independent, although in time to come, it seems that they began to consider the Bishop of Rome first among equals. But this was not the Roman Catholic Church that would exist after Constantine endowed it and created power and centralized everything and gave the church the kind of power he did. But before that, before about 325, there was no such thing as the Roman Catholic Church as we know it. Now, the belief in the pre-existence of Jesus Christ was held all across all known Christianity in those early centuries. Nobody questioned it at all. This was because the first generations were more profoundly affected by the apostles and the men the apostles had in turn taught than later generations would be. But the documents were controlling in their Christology. That's Christ and ology. You can add that to your vocabulary list. Christology is simply the theological interpretation of the person and work of Jesus Christ. So they were basically, the documents were controlling. There was nowhere to go with them at that time. The first fly in the ointment appeared in the early 4th century in the person of one man named Arius. He was I don't think he was a bishop. I think he was a theologian of Alexandria, obviously a very intellectual man. The difficulty is best expressed in a letter he wrote to Eusebius at the time. Here's what he said. I will quote it for you. But we say and believe and have taught and do teach that the Son is not unbegotten or in any way part of the unbegotten, that he does not derive his subsistence from any matter, but that by his own will and counsel he has subsisted before time and before ages as perfect God. Arius believed that the Son was perfect God before time, but not eternal. Only begotten and unchangeable, and that before he was begotten or created or purposed or established, he was not. In other words, go back far enough, you come to a place where Jesus, the Word, did not exist. That's what Arius believed. Now, where did he come with this? And interestingly enough, many people say that the argument as advanced did not depend a great deal on Scripture. It was more a question of logic, development, extensions of this, because this was a highly intellectual, very well-educated individual, was Arius. He said that himself, his group, were persecuted because they say the Son has a beginning, but God is without beginning. That's what they said. Now, even as late, this is interesting to me, for a peculiar reason, even as late as the 4th century, the divinity of Jesus and his pre-existence were not in dispute. Anywhere. And this is unusual to think about this, because almost every heresy you find in the modern world has some kind of roots back in the past, because people were always, wrestling with these things and thinking about them. If it existed, we don't know about it. All that was believed was, and the only thing that was in dispute by the time we come to the 4th century, was his eternity. Has he always existed? Now, the interesting thing about this, I don't know how Arius ever came to that, because the Bible does not discuss the time before time. It only deals with Project Earth. But like the atheists of today, Arius claimed absolute knowledge of events prior to the time there was a planet in this part of space, and I don't think there's enough information for that. As I said, the Bible is only concerned with Project Earth. Now, it will not surprise me in the least to learn that there have been other projects in far distant time, but they are clean beyond the scope of any divine revelation to us. Thus is also the question of how and what the relationship was between Father and Son before Project Earth was even conceived. Now, we go on to look at this well past the 4th century. No one who believes in Jesus doubts in the least that Jesus existed before his human birth. Least of all, the men who wrote the documents that comprise the New Testament. What Arius did accomplish was to provoke the Council of Nicaea to adopt the doctrine of the Trinity in the sternest possible means, and go on down, because they got tired of having to wrestle with all the different flakes that were coming around with new ideas and new doctrines. It was another 1,200 years before the next big Christological dust-up appeared on the scene, and that was a man named Laelius Socinus who came up with that one. That's also another story for another day. I'm not going to go there today. There are many things about Jesus that are something of a mystery to us, and that's not our fault. But there is a lot that can be known. There is a lot that is in the record, and we can content ourselves with that. And you can feel absolutely confident that when you appear before God, and He says, you didn't have this right, you can say, well, Lord, I did the best I can, because there it is, it's in the book. That's why I understood it, with the mind that you gave me to understand things. So I think we'll be okay with Him. But since there are so many more things we could talk about, I'm not nearly through with this subject. But in mercy, I'll not go on today.